So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take section 4 and section 5 together because they are like a preview and a what's the opposite of a preview? And a look back. So let's take a look. Section 4 is about codes and cultures, and we're looking at, when we get to the end, hopefully you can have an idea of some of the factors that shape a culture's verbal and nonverbal codes. Okay, and the codes are really the set of rules that we use in a language. So this slide talks about, or one section talks about verbal codes, and these are really covered in much more depth in chapter 5, which is all about language. But language and identity. The textbook brings up a really good point that if you ask an American or someone from an individualistic culture, what's your name? We will start with our first name, and then we will give our family name. But if you ask that same question of someone from a collectivistic culture, they would give the family name first, or possibly their caste. In India, they might talk about caste and village. So that the way that people speak can give you an idea about the kind of culture that they come from. And the kind of culture a person comes from gives you an idea of how they're going to speak. So thought it was interesting that there's the book called 100 Ways to Say I in Japanese. It says Japanese has as many as 100 different ways to say I, depending on whether you want to be polite, casual, businesslike, or arrogant, to emphasize your family role, your social situation, age, or gender. So, I mean, that's just, I think in the United States we have maybe one way to say I. Okay, the next idea that falls under verbal codes is verbal communication styles, and every culture has a certain style, and they talk about only 3 of the big ones. Okay, we talked about directness and indirectness when we were talking about high context and low context. So if you are from a low context culture, you believe that being direct is the way to go. If you are from a high context culture, you would value indirectness more. The elaborateness or succinctness comes into play with, I'm trying to think of a, are you more, is it more to the point, or do you tend to be more elaborate? Now, I don't have first-hand knowledge of this, but the textbook says that Arabic is a language that really expresses elaborateness. That it is a mark of culture to be able to express yourself in a way that in the United States we would consider overdone. There's too many words. Whereas in the United States, if we value succinctness in the Arabic world, we would be considered to be writing or speaking in a somewhat childish manner. Right? Interesting. It says, I like this, succinctness is most extreme in cultures where silence is valued. So even though in the United States we are more succinct, we also tend to talk quite a bit. And if you're in a situation that's a little bit uncomfortable, you might be the person who would just keep talking to, you're not really sure what to say, so just keep talking. Whereas many of the Native American cultures would just say nothing. And that can be misunderstood from both sides. The next one is formality and informality, and this has nothing to do with, not using contractions. I do not want to go. That's not what we mean. It has to do with how we interact with other people. Americans are infamous maybe for their informality. There's a great, on page 56, there's a great paragraph about someone from England, saying, "Look, when you go to the United States, this is something that you need to know about the people there," and they're just, almost superficial, friendly, but possibly superficially friendly, very informal. In some cultures, it's formality. You are very careful about the relationship that you have with other people. When we get to chapter 5, we'll talk about this more, but in Chinese, for example, there are many different ways for saying uncle, depending on if it's on your mother's side or your father's side, and if it's by birth or marriage, and that indicates a much more formal way of interacting with other people. So in the last section, I actually talked about code switching and how my colleague, Professor Hansen, is a master at code switching. So as we all do this, you don't talk to your grandmother the same way that you talk to your friends. You might not be vastly different, but you definitely using a different code. There's a different code that, in your brain you have the rule. Don't talk about certain subjects with grandma, or don't use certain language with grandma. I mean, imagine the way that, just think about a situation where you treat, maybe you're talking to a 5-year-old, and you're talking to your really good friends, and you're talking to someone who's much older and who you respect. And just imagine that you're using the way you interact with one group with the wrong group, and what that would be like. Okay, so these are some of the verbal codes. But of course, there are also nonverbal codes, which we will talk about much more in chapter 6. So there are more similarities than there are differences with nonverbals. We all convey messages through our facial expression, through gestures, through how close we stand. They say, for example, there's everyone in every culture, a smile means that you are pleased or happy, and tears mean that you are sad. So that's the same from culture to culture, but there is a tremendous range in nonverbal behavior, and a big one that's really obvious is the idea of personal space. How close do we stand to each other? And as I said, we will talk about this in chapter 6. But if you prefer to have a certain distance between you and people you're talking to based on your cultural norms, and you're speaking with someone who wants to be much closer or much farther away, you can see how this is going to create some difficult communication situations. Also, there are some people, when they're talking to you, they like to have their hand on your shoulder or on your arm. Do you like that? Or do you feel like you're being trapped in some way? So this range in nonverbal behavior, which I think is fascinating, can also cause a lot of communication issues. Okay, so the last section has to do with, all right, now you know all of this information. How can you become more competent at communicating interculturally? And when I say culturally, it could be interculturally. So what are the attitudes, knowledge, and skills required for intercultural competence? So you remember what communication competence is. So you're going to see there's some overlap. You have to be motivated. You have to have a good attitude. You have to have knowledge and skills. That's the basis for any kind of communication competence. But when you're bringing in the intercultural aspect, you have to be tolerant for ambiguity, because you are going to be in situations where you do not understand exactly what is going on. And if you get freaked out or angry, that's going to close down communication. And I think this tolerance for ambiguity, you have to realize that you will probably make some mistakes, and that's okay because you're learning, right? The next aspect is being open-minded. I think for most of us, the default setting is my way is the right way, or my way is natural. mean, that's just how we feel because we're very used to it. So what you have to make sure is that when you're communicating interculturally, that you take a step back from ethnocentrism, that the way my ethnic group, the way my group does it is the best way, and that everyone else is, you have to be aware of prejudice, that you go into a situation thinking that, well, these people are fill in the blank, and therefore they don't communicate correctly, or the way they do things is wrong. Or we don't always think about this with prejudice. The way they do things is so wonderful. How about just going in open-minded? Let me see what's going to happen in this situation. Okay, so as I said, knowledge and skills. The more you know about a situation that you're going into, the better, and the more you can practice, the better. And I think a lot of us don't want to practice because we don't want to be wrong. So how are you going to develop your skills unless you actually go out there and put them into practice? I notice in public speaking, I have a lot of students who resist actually rehearsing their speech. They say, oh, they want their speech to just come off very naturally. And I have to tell you, those speeches usually aren't very good because they haven't taken the time to develop their skills. So the same thing goes with conversations. You've got to practice in order to get better at it. And the last one is patience and perseverance. You will experience setbacks. So when after I graduated from college, I joined the Peace Corps, and I went to Niger in West Africa. If you look at a map, it is north of Nigeria and south of Libya. It's pretty much Sahara Desert for most of it. And the language of education there is French, and my French was not very good. So I made a lot of mistakes. And I had the feeling that people thought I was kind of stupid because I was making mistakes that only little kids would make. And I had to persevere. I had to realize that I was going to make mistakes, but the only way that I was going to get good at communicating with people was to keep doing it. I was a little younger then too, so maybe the perseverance was easier. The patience, I was not a patient youngster. But those are the two components that are really necessary, the last two components that are going to be necessary for being for being competent at intercultural communication. And that is the end of chapter 2, all about culture.